The day before my birthday, the air inside our house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The light coming through the window had a dullness to it, no longer warm, no longer playful. I remember staring at the dust floating in the beam of sunlight on my bedroom floor, trying to imagine how tomorrow might feel, believing it would be filled with something as simple as a cake, maybe a couple of balloons, and my mother quietly moving around the kitchen. That was the kind of birthday I knew, small and plain, but still mine. I did not expect that the last day of my childhood would end differently, that it would not end with laughter or candles, but with a sound that still wakes me in the middle of the night. It was the sound of my bedroom door closing behind him, not slamming, not loud, but deliberate. A click that locked out the rest of the world and locked me in with something I did not yet have words for. His footsteps were slow, almost measured, as if each one was meant to remind me of his presence. I sat frozen on my bed, my hands gripping the blanket so tightly that the fabric bunched between my fingers. My heart thudded in my ears, drowning out the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the only sound left outside the closed door. His voice broke the silence. It was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that makes you more afraid than shouting ever could. He said I needed to grow up for real. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange, and though I was just a child, I knew that nothing good could come after them. I did not understand the full meaning then, but my body reacted before my mind could. My stomach tightened, my skin prickled. The air felt thinner, like it was being pulled out of the room. I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, the same one people in town said made him seem so respectable. That smell would follow me for years, showing up in places and moments I least expected, each time pulling me back into this exact moment. His shadow loomed over me before he even touched me. The sun outside had shifted, casting long shapes across the floor that seemed to reach towards me, trapping me in place. I wanted to call for my mother, but the thought of her face stopped me. I already knew she would not come, or if she did, she would not stop him. Everything I had believed about safety in my home cracked in those seconds. The walls, the hallway, the familiar creak in the floor near my bed. All of it suddenly felt like part of a cage. I remember my breathing becoming shallow, my chest aching as if my ribs were too tight. The air smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, though I could not place it. The curtains moved slightly in the summer breeze from the window, and I found myself staring at them as if they could carry me away. He took another step closer, and the mattress dipped slightly as he sat down. My fingers went numb from gripping the blanket so hard. I felt the heat of his presence, without him even touching me. The weight of that moment settled on my chest, pressing me into the mattress as though I had no way to rise again. My mind began to drift, a defense I would come to know well, floating away from my own body, while my eyes stayed fixed on something simple, like the small crack in the wall near my dresser. Outside, a car passed, its tires crunching over gravel, and for a second I imagined running out to it, waving my arms, begging someone to take me anywhere else. But my feet wouldn't move. I was pinned by more than just fear. It was the certainty that no one would believe me, that everyone would see him as the man they knew in public, the man who helped fix fences for neighbors, the man who smiled at church. That certainty was heavier than his body ever could be. He leaned in slightly, close enough that I could hear his breathing, slow and steady. The space between each inhale felt like an eternity, each exhale brushing against my skin like an unspoken threat. My eyes burned, but I refused to let the tears fall. Crying felt like it would give him something more to take. I focused on my hands, on the feel of the rough blanket against my palms, grounding myself in the texture, because it was the only thing that still felt real. Time did not move normally in that room. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into something endless. I did not know yet that this would be the first in a long chain of moments like this, but I knew my world had shifted. There was no going back to the kind of birthday I had imagined. No going back to a life where my bedroom door meant privacy or safety. That quiet click of the latch had changed everything. and I felt it settle into me like a cold that would never leave. The house remained still, as though it too was holding its breath. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled the leaves in the old oak tree, the one I used to climb before I was told I was too old for such games. The sound should have been comforting, but it only made the silence inside the room feel deeper, more final. The air pressed in on me, and I realized that whatever was about to happen, I would have to find a way to survive it, even if it meant leaving a part of myself behind in this very moment. My name is Helena Marie Collins, and today I'm 68 years old. I live in a quiet town in the middle of Kansas, the kind of place where the air smells of wheat fields in summer, and the streets are so still at night that you can hear the distant hum of a train miles away. My home is small but warm, a single-story house with creaking wooden floors, and a garden that I tend to every morning. My days are spent sewing for the people in town, repairing old quilts, making dresses for church events, and sometimes baking pies for neighbors. The routine is simple and peaceful on the surface, but it exists over a foundation built from years of silence. When I walk to the corner store, people greet me with a nod or a smile. They see a woman with silver hair pulled back neatly, hands worn from years of work, and a calm voice. They do not see the child I once was. They do not hear the echoes of footsteps behind a closed door or feel the weight of words that were meant to break me. I have learned to move through life like a person crossing thin ice, careful with each step, making sure the cracks do not show. I can still picture the town from my childhood, the rows of old brick buildings with faded signs, the diner on the main street where the smell of coffee drifted into the cold morning air. My father was known by everyone. People would wave to him from across the road, ask for his help fixing a fence, or invite him to sit and share a drink. He was the kind of man people trusted without question. In public, he was attentive, polite, always ready to lend a hand. That image was so deeply rooted in the town's mind that no one could have imagined what happened in the shadows of our home. My mother was quieter. She moved through the house like she was always listening for something. Her hands were never still. She would shell peas at the kitchen table, fold laundry that smelled faintly of soap and sunlight, or stir a pot of soup without ever looking up when my father entered the room. There was a stiffness in her shoulders that I did not understand as a child, a stillness in her face that only made sense years later. She was not simply quiet. She was contained, like someone who knew the walls had ears. Our house was built from old wood, the kind that groaned under every step. The windows were drafty in winter, and in summer the heat pressed against the walls until the air inside felt heavy. My room faced the backyard, where an oak tree stood like a sentinel, its branches swaying gently on windy days. That tree was my refuge. I would climb it with scraped knees and sticky hands from popsicles, pretending I was a lookout in some grand adventure. I did not realize then how much I needed that sense of escape. At the time, I believed our family was just like everyone else's. We went to church every Sunday, sat together in the same worn wooden pew. My father would keep his arm around my mother's shoulders as the pastor spoke, and from the outside, it must have looked like love. Inside, it felt like a performance. My mother's eyes rarely met his, and when they did, there was no warmth there. I remember wondering if all mothers avoided their husband's gaze like that, if that was simply what marriage became after enough years. My father's presence filled every space he entered. His boots on the floor made a sound I could recognize from any room in the house. There was a rhythm to it, a steady beat that carried an unspoken warning. Even when he was in a good mood, there was an edge beneath his voice, a tension that made you measure your words. That tension taught me to be careful, to keep my feelings folded away like delicate fabric that could tear if handled roughly. Life in our town moved at a slow pace, but inside our home, time often felt unpredictable. Some evenings were almost normal. My father would sit in his chair reading the newspaper while my mother and I prepared dinner. Other nights, a single wrong word could turn the air sharp, like the moment before a storm breaks. I learned early to watch the signs, the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair, the silence that settled over him like a dark cloud before the rain. Even now, all these decades later, I can recall the scent of the coffee my mother brewed every morning. It filled the kitchen with a warmth that made the first moments of the day feel safe, even if that safety was an illusion. I would sit at the table with my bare feet on the cool linoleum floor, tracing the patterns with my toes while my mother set a plate in front of me. I held on to those small rituals because they were the only parts of the day that felt predictable. I think back to how the people in town spoke of my father. They would say he was a good man, a man who could be trusted with anything. The irony was that they were right in one sense. He could be trusted completely to protect his image, to guard it with such care that no one could see the truth. It was a truth I carried alone, one that would become heavier with each passing year until the weight was almost too much for me to bear. It is strange how memory works. Certain details fade, yet others remain vivid as if they happened yesterday. The way the sunlight came through the lace curtains in the living room, the sound of the screen door slamming when my father came in from outside, the way my mother's hands trembled ever so slightly when she poured his coffee. These moments stitched themselves into the fabric of who I am, impossible to pull apart without unraveling everything. The life I lead now is quiet, almost ordinary. I work, I tend to my garden, I wave to my neighbors. But beneath that quiet, there is an undercurrent that never leaves, a reminder of what once was, and of the child I used to be before the air in my home grew heavy, and the sound of footsteps behind a closed door changed the way I saw the world. I grew up in a wooden house that always seemed to speak in its own language. The floorboards groaned when you crossed the hallway. The wind whistled through the gaps in the old windows, and the screen door banged shut with a sound that could be heard from the back of the yard. In the summers, the air inside felt thick and slow, carrying the smell of cut grass and warm earth. In the winters, the cold settled in like an uninvited guest, seeping through the walls no matter how tightly the windows were shut. From the outside, it looked like a place full of warmth, the kind of home where you might expect laughter to echo through the rooms. But appearances can be liars. As a child, I noticed things without fully understanding them. My father was respected by everyone we knew. He was the man who would fix a neighbor's fence after a storm or help carry heavy sacks of feed for someone's livestock. People called him reliable, a man of his word. He walked through town with an easy smile and a firm handshake, and the world responded by trusting him without hesitation. That trust was like a shield, one that made him untouchable. My mother, in contrast, seemed to move as if each step was measured. She was always busy, always keeping her hands occupied as if stillness might draw attention she did not want. She folded clothes with perfect precision, stirred pots of stew without lifting her eyes, and washed dishes so methodically it was almost hypnotic. She rarely spoke in my father's presence unless he spoke to her first. Even at the time, before I could name it, I sensed that her quiet was not born from peace. It was born from survival. It was in small, almost invisible ways that I began to notice a shift in my father's attention toward me. At first it seemed harmless. He would hold his gaze on me a little longer than before. His compliments started to feel heavier, wrapped in a tone I could not quite place. Sometimes he would comment on how I was growing, his voice slow and deliberate. I remember sitting on the living room rug playing with my dolls and feeling his eyes on me from across the room. He would stand in the doorway, leaning just slightly against the frame, watching without saying a word. There were moments when his touches lingered. A hand on my shoulder that stayed a second too long, an arm around me that pressed me closer than felt right. I did not have the words to explain why it made me uneasy. No one had told me what boundaries were, but my body seemed to know when they were being crossed. I learned to avoid being alone in a room with him, slipping away quietly when I heard his boots on the floor. One of the earliest incidents that stayed with me happened on a late summer afternoon. My mother had gone to hang laundry outside, and I was in the kitchen drawing shapes on a piece of paper. My father walked in, his shadow falling over the table. He asked what I was doing, and before I could answer, he pulled up a chair right next to me. The smell of his cologne mixed with the scent of the wood polish from the table. He placed his hand over mine, guiding the pencil as if to help me, but his hand didn't move away when the drawing was done. He told me my hands were small, fragile, and that one day I would need to be stronger. His voice was soft, but carried something that made the back of my neck prickle. After that, the small moments multiplied. If I was carrying laundry to the bedroom, he would appear suddenly in the hallway, blocking the way for just a little too long before stepping aside. If I sat on the couch, he would sit closer than necessary, his knee brushing mine even when there was plenty of space. And always, his eyes were fixed on me in a way that felt like he was looking through me rather than at me. My mother's role in those moments was hard to read. Sometimes she would be nearby, busy with some task, and she would glance in our direction without a word. Her face would not change, but her hands would move faster, as if she was hurrying through whatever she was doing. Other times, she seemed to simply not see. It was as though she had trained herself to be blind to certain things, perhaps because acknowledging them would mean having to act. The house began to feel smaller. The rooms that once seemed spacious to a child started to feel like traps. Even the places I had loved most, like the oak tree in the backyard, became tainted because I could feel his presence watching me from the window when I was outside. The air carried an unspoken warning that was impossible to ignore. School became my safe space. The smell of chalk dust, the sound of pencils scratching on paper, the chatter of other children. These things wrapped around me like armor. But even there, I felt the edges of fear. I worried about going home at the end of the day. I measured my afternoons in the number of hours before his boots would be on the porch again. It was in those years that I began to master the art of pretending. I could smile at him when people were around, answer politely when he spoke, and look like any other well-behaved daughter in the eyes of the town. But inside, I was learning something darker. How to read the tension in a room before anyone spoke. How to make myself smaller. How to disappear in plain sight. Those early signs were seeds planted in the soil of my childhood. Seeds that would grow into something far more dangerous. At the time, I didn't know how quickly they would take root or how deep they would go. All I knew was that the space between my father's shadow and my own felt smaller every day. And soon, there would be nowhere left to step without being in it. The change was gradual at first, like the slow tightening of a rope you do not notice until it is cutting into your skin. What had begun as lingering touches and strange looks became commands that left no space for refusal. His voice lost its softness, replaced with a tone that carried no doubt about whether I would obey. He told me I needed to learn what it meant to grow up, and in his mind, that meant bending entirely to his control. Objects in the house became part of his methods. The leather belt that once hung on the back of his closet door was no longer just for show. I learned to fear the sound it made when he pulled it free, the sharp snap of it against the air before it touched my skin. Sometimes it was the wooden handle of a broom pressed into my side as he whispered that I should not cry too loudly. Other times, it was the kitchen towel he twisted tightly around my wrists, the fabric biting into my skin while the rest of the house sat in silence. He did not only want obedience, he wanted isolation. He began finding reasons to keep me home from school. A headache, a stomach ache, excuses he made up to ensure I stayed within reach. When I protested, he would lower his voice to a calm whisper and tell me that no one out there cared about me the way he did, that I was better off under his watch. The words sank into me like splinters, small but sharp, leaving wounds no one could see. My mother's presence in these moments was a kind of cruelty of its own. Sometimes she would appear in the doorway, holding a plate of food, her eyes fixed on some spot above my head as she set it down and turned away. She never stayed long enough to watch. Other times, she would leave the house entirely, disappearing for hours, returning with groceries or laundry as if nothing had happened. I could not decide which was worse, her seeing and doing nothing or her absence that left me alone with him. The worst nights were when he mixed control with performance. He would act like everything was normal in front of others, smiling, telling stories, and then, as soon as the door shut behind the last visitor, his face would shift. His hand would close around my arm with a grip that left no doubt of his intentions. He would drag me to my room, the sound of my feet scraping across the floor drowned out by the pounding of my heartbeat. There was one evening that has never left me. I had been sick with a fever for 2 days, my body aching and my head pounding. I remember lying under the thin blanket, too weak to move much, when the door opened. He came in carrying a chair, setting it down next to my bed. The look on his face was not concern. It was something colder. He told me that being sick was no excuse to ignore him. His voice was steady, almost gentle, but his hands were not. That night, I learned that even illness would not protect me. Sometimes he would speak as if he were teaching me something, as if the cruelty was part of some lesson I needed to learn. He told me that I was strong because I could take it, that other girls would not survive what I could. At the time, I did not understand that he was twisting strength into submission, turning survival into something I was supposed to thank him for. The walls of my room began to feel closer each day. The smell of the old wood and the faint mildew in the corners became constant reminders of what happened there. I could hear the familiar creak of the hallway floorboards before he reached the door, and sometimes that sound alone was enough to make my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. The sound of his boots on the porch became an alarm that went off inside me, warning me that the hours ahead would belong entirely to him. I tried to find small ways to protect myself. I would hide in the far corner of the yard when he was home, pretending to be busy with chores. I would lock the bathroom door and let the water run for as long as I could, just to have a few minutes of space, though I knew the lock would not stop him if he decided to enter. I learned to speak less, to keep my answers short, to avoid anything that might spark his temper. But nothing worked for long. The control he wanted was complete, and it grew heavier with each passing day. The moments of quiet in the house began to feel dangerous, because quiet meant he was thinking, waiting, planning. Even when I was not with him, the thought of him sat in my mind like a shadow I could not step out of. One night, he told me there would be a punishment that would make me understand once and for all that resistance was useless. His words were slow, deliberate, each one hitting like a drop of cold water. That punishment lasted 3 days. 3 days when I was not allowed to leave my room except when he decided. 3 days when I was tied to the bed with the same kitchen towels my mother used to dry the dishes. She came in only once, not to help me, but to hand him a plate of food before leaving again. The shame of those hours burned as much as the physical pain, and when it was over, something in me felt smaller, dimmer, as if a part of my voice had been taken and buried somewhere I could not reach. By then, I no longer thought in terms of days or weeks. Time had turned into stretches of waiting, waiting for the sound of his steps, waiting for the door to close, waiting for whatever he decided would happen next. My world had narrowed to the edges of those moments, and the idea of escape felt like something that belonged in a dream, too far away to touch, yet too necessary to stop imagining. After those 3 days, I felt as though my body had been hollowed out, and my mind had been pushed into some far-away corner. My arms were sore from the knots that had held me, my skin raw where the fabric had bitten into it. I moved slowly, not because of the pain, but because every step felt uncertain, as if the ground itself might shift beneath me. The fever that had come and gone during those days left me weak, but it also left me with a strange clarity. Something had changed inside me. When I returned to school, I carried that change with me. I sat at my desk in the back of the classroom, avoiding the curious glances of the other kids. My hands shook when I tried to write, and the words on the page blurred as if they were slipping away from me. That morning, my teacher, Mrs. Thompson, lingered by my desk longer than usual. She was a tall woman with kind eyes and a voice that could be both gentle and firm. She asked if I was feeling well, her tone careful, like she was afraid of pushing too hard. I nodded quickly, but she didn't move on right away. Instead, she crouched down so that her eyes were level with mine and told me that I seemed quieter than usual. It was such a simple observation, but it landed in my chest like a stone. Someone had noticed. In the days that followed, she began finding small reasons to speak to me alone. Sometimes she would ask me to stay after class to help clean the chalkboard or stack books in the corner. Other times, she would stop me in the hallway to ask about my homework. Her questions were never direct, but I could feel her watching closely, waiting for something to slip through the cracks. For a while I stayed silent. It wasn't that I didn't want to speak, but the words were heavy, tangled together in a way I couldn't untie. At home, nothing had changed. My father moved through the rooms with the same heavy steps, his voice carrying the same sharp edge. My mother continued her quiet routine, her eyes always fixed somewhere just beyond me. But something inside me had begun to resist. It was small at first, like the faint glow of an ember under ash, but it was there. I started to pay more attention to the details of his routine. When he left the house, how long he stayed out, when my mother would disappear into the garden. I began tucking away small pieces of information, not even fully sure why, only knowing that someday I might need them. One afternoon, while walking home from school, I noticed that my father's truck wasn't in the driveway. My mother was in the kitchen, her back to me, chopping vegetables. I asked her if she needed help, but she just shook her head without turning around. Something in her posture told me not to press further. I went to my room, sat on the bed, and stared at the window that looked out over the street. I imagined walking down the road and not stopping until I reached somewhere he couldn't follow. The thought was fleeting, but it left a mark, a reminder that there was a world beyond the walls of our house. Mrs. Thompson's presence at school became the thread I held on to. She never asked me to explain, but she created spaces where I felt safer than anywhere else. During recess, when the other kids ran and shouted, I would sometimes stay behind in the classroom, pretending to read. She would sit at her desk, grading papers, and every so often she would glance up and give me a small nod. It was an unspoken agreement that I could stay there without question. The turning point came on a Wednesday afternoon. The school day had ended and most of the kids had already left. I was helping Mrs. Thompson gather books from the shelves when she stopped, holding one in her hands, and looked at me for a long moment. Her voice was quiet when she asked if everything at home was okay. The question made my throat tighten. I wanted to say yes, to give the answer I always gave, but my body betrayed me. My eyes filled before I could stop them, and I felt the warmth of tears spilling down my cheeks. She didn't rush me or press for answers. She simply said, "You can tell me anything, and I will believe you." Those words sank deep into me, deeper than any kindness I had been shown in years. No one had ever told me they would believe me before I even spoke. In that moment I realized I had been waiting for someone to offer me that assurance. I didn't tell her everything right then, but I told her enough for her to understand that something was very wrong, enough for her to promise that she would help me, no matter how long it took. After that day, my mind began to shift. I was still afraid, but the fear was no longer the only thing guiding me. I began to think about possibilities, about the fact that there were people outside my house who could see me for who I really was, not the version my father wanted them to see. I started to imagine what it would feel like to wake up in a place where the sound of footsteps didn't make my heart race. The ember inside me burned a little brighter. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, and I had no idea how or when I would take the next step. But for the first time, I was beginning to believe that the life I was living was not the only one available to me. And once that belief took root, it was impossible to let it go. The night the storm came, the air outside was thick and electric, the kind of air that makes the hair on your arms rise before the first clap of thunder. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches like they were made of wire. Rain pounded against the windows in angry bursts, and the sound of the gutters overflowing filled the silence inside the house. My father had gone out earlier that evening saying he was meeting some friends. I didn't ask questions. I never asked questions. I just noted the time he left and listened carefully to the sound of his truck fading into the distance. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. My mind was racing, and the storm outside seemed to beat in rhythm with my heartbeat. For weeks, I had been storing away the smallest moments of courage. Mrs. Thompson's words, the steady way she had looked at me, the belief she had placed in me without needing proof. I thought about the narrow world inside this house and the bigger one just beyond the front door. That night, the storm didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like it was on my side, like it was creating the perfect cover for something I had never dared to imagine. I waited until I was sure my mother had gone to her room. I could hear her faint footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of her door closing. My hands shook as I slipped on my coat and pulled my shoes from under the bed. The rain hit my face the moment I stepped outside, soaking me instantly, but I didn't care. The cold wind bit at my skin, but every drop of water seemed to push me forward instead of holding me back. My feet moved faster than my thoughts, carrying me down the familiar street toward the only place I felt truly safe. By the time I reached Mrs. Thompson's house, my hair was plastered to my face and my clothes clung to me like a second skin. I hesitated for only a second before knocking, the sound nearly swallowed by the roar of the storm. The door opened and she stood there, her expression shifting from surprise to deep concern in an instant. She pulled me inside without a single question, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders and guiding me toward the couch. The warmth of her home felt unreal, like stepping into a different world. She didn't press for details that night. She just made me a cup of tea, sat across from me, and let me know I could stay as long as I needed. The way she said it made me believe her completely. That was the first time in years I felt like I could close my eyes without fear of what might happen while I slept. The next morning, she contacted the authorities. Everything after that felt like a blur. Questions, statements, paperwork, and the heavy, unfamiliar presence of police officers in the room. They asked me things I had never said out loud before, and each answer felt like pulling a thorn from deep inside my skin. Painful, but necessary. There were moments when I wanted to stop, when the weight of speaking the truth felt like it might crush me. But each time, I remembered that this was the only way to end the life I had been trapped in. The investigation that followed was long and exhausting. People I had known my entire life looked at me differently, some with sympathy, others with disbelief. My father's image in the town did not crumble easily. There were those who defended him, who insisted that I must be mistaken. But there were also those who stood firmly by my side, refusing to let me carry the burden alone. Mrs. Thompson was at every meeting, every hearing, sitting just close enough that I could feel her presence. When it was finally over, and I was no longer under his control, the quiet felt strange. For years, silence had been a warning, a sign that something was about to happen. Now it was something else entirely. It was peace. It was safety. It was mine. I learned that healing is not a straight line. There were days when I felt lighter, and days when the past sat on my shoulders like it had never left. But I also learned that surviving is not just about enduring the worst moments. It's about finding ways to live beyond them, to create a life where those moments no longer define every breath you take. Today, when I walk through my garden or sit at my sewing machine, I think about that night in the storm. I think about how a single decision, made in fear but also in hope, became the first step toward freedom. I still carry the memories, but they are no longer chains. They are reminders of how far I have come. To those who are listening to my story, I want you to know that even in the darkest places, there are people who will believe you, who will stand by you, who will help you find the way out. You are not invisible, and you are not alone. Thank you for being here, for hearing my truth. If my words have reached you, if they have sparked something inside you, stay with me. There is more to share, more to uncover, and more voices that deserve to be heard. You can watch the next chapter of this journey right here on the screen. I hope you will join me there, because together we can keep the light on for someone still trying to find their way out of the dark.